All right, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to the Centennial Virtual Speaker Series presented by the Southwestern Political Science Association. We're pleased you could join us to talk today about the 2020 election with specific focus on the role of women. Just to introduce the panelists to everyone, I'm Beth Vanami. I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I'm also Vice President of the Southwestern Political Science Association. And I'm joined by a couple of my committee members, fellow Executive Council members. Dr. Jennifer Horan is the President of the Southwestern Political Science Association and an associate professor. There you are, give a little wave, Jennifer. Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I'm also joined by Dr. Tiffany Howard, who is an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And she's also the director of the Center for, let me get it right here, Migration, Demography, and Population Studies. I knew I was gonna not get the words in the right order. There we go, at UNLV. And then I'm also joined by my colleague here at UMKC, Dr. Deborah Leiter, who's an associate professor of political science. But the stars of today's panel are not us, but our panelists that we've invited who are prominent scholars and directors of women's representation and politics in the United States. So let me give a little bio and intro to each of our panelists. I'll start with who's on my upper corner is Dr. Danielle Thompson. Dr. Thompson is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. Her research interests fit squarely into our panel as she studies American politics, the US Congress, political parties, and gender in politics. I encourage you to read her very timely and poignant book, Opting Out of Congress, Partisan Polarization and the Decline of Moderate Candidates, which focuses on partisan polarization in Congress. But she has lots of other work, which is featured in some of the top journals of political science, including the APSR and the Journal of Politics, in which she talks about women's representation in Congress, paying particular attention to the party differences that we see in American politics. Welcome, Dr. Thompson. We also have with us, and are pleased to have with us, Dr. Karen Kudrowski, who's the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics and also a professor of political science at Iowa State University. The Catt Center is near and dear to my heart, as Dr. Leiter and I have received a grant from them in the past. They conduct research on women in politics with a specific focus on Iowa and civic engagement. Dr. Kudrowski, though, also teaches in the political science department, teaching courses on American politics and doing research on women in American politics and civic engagement. Prior to coming to Iowa State, Dr. Kudrowski was 24 years at Winthrop University in South Carolina, where she served among many roles as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She also received Winthrop's highest faculty honor, which is that of Distinguished Professor. So welcome, Distinguished Professor Kudrowski. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Kelly Dittmer. Dr. Dittmer is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University Camden and director of research and scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. She manages the national research projects, helps develop and implement the center's research agenda, and contributes to reports, publications, and analyses. She also has been an expert source and commentator on many national media outlets where you may have seen her, like MSNBC, NPR, and the New York Times. Dr. Dittmer's research focuses on gender and American political institutions, and she has two really great books that I encourage you to seek out. One of them is called A Seat at the Table, which is a great title, Congresswomen's Perspectives on Why Their Representation Matters, and Navigating Gender Terrain, Stereotypes and Strategy in Political Campaigns. Thank you for joining us today. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about how this is going to work. If you have any questions, that is the audience, if you have any questions, you can post them throughout in the Q&A, and Dr. Howard, Leiter, and Horan will start collating those, and then at the second hour, Dr. Howard will ask those questions that come from the audience. You can also post them in the chat if you're not familiar with the Q&A feature of the Zoom webinar, which is very sophisticated. So let's get started. We'll start by asking questions to all of the panelists, and I'm just going to randomly select who goes first on each of them, if you don't mind. And then if the rest just want to chime in after that, that would be great with any additional information. So I think we can start with the elephant in the room, which I think is the fact that we are about to have our first female vice president, which is super exciting, I think, to all of us. Can you talk generally about how historic this moment is and how important this is to female office holders and voters? And we'll start with Dr. Thompson.
Great, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here among such a great group of panelists. So yes, this is the elephant in the room, a very exciting moment for women in politics, for women of color, and for America more generally. So there's a lot of different effects that researchers have shown that women in office have. So I think one that is really important here is the symbolic effect. Scholars have shown that there's a role model effect associated with electing women to office, and that this spurs political interest and political knowledge among young women and girls. So I think that matters a lot and is hard to measure, but incredibly important. We also would expect this to matter for policy outcomes, not only with respect to women's issues and how much more attention women's issues get on the legislative and policy agenda, but also with respect to like responsiveness and how connected constituents, in this case the whole US, is to their elected officials. Then I'll also add, as a new Californian, because I would be remiss, there was some talk earlier in the cycle about how the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency would tilt some of the geographic balance towards the West Coast. And that's something that's talked about less, I think, than these other factors, but I think is really important and something that some political observers have raised as well.
Thanks, Danielle. Does Karen or Kelly, would you like to add? Start with Karen. How about that?
Sorry, I couldn't find my cursor with my mouse. So again, thank you for having me here. And I know several of the people on the panel have actually won Cat Center research prizes. So I really do feel like I am here among friends. In terms of what Danielle said, you know, she's spot on. But I think there's another piece of this too that, you know, that Senator Harris, Vice President-elect Harris, is going to bring to the table. And that is President-elect Biden's style is really one based on personal relationships. And of course, he had a very long career in the Senate, but he has been out of the Senate since 2009. He's been out of public life for the last 4 years. And Senator Harris has relationships as a senator herself with the current generation of senators. And so I think that means that she'll be able to build upon those relationships and perhaps bring some people to the table that that President-elect Biden would not be able to do on her own. So it was a very astute pick on that front.
Yeah, and I would add two other things. One, in terms of, and sorry, I thank you guys for having me too. And I'm always excited to have these conversations with other smart women. But so one of the things that this also represented is the return on investment to Black women. And so I want to be careful and not say Kamala Harris represents all Black women. At the same point, we know that Black women's organizations, Black women voters, there were petitions, right? Black women voters have been key to Democratic successes for decades and beyond, right? And so Black women have been doing the work on the ground. They have voted at the highest rates of any race and gender subgroup, and 90+% for Democrats, particularly in 2008 and 2012, making the key part of the Obama coalition. And in the last couple of cycles, you've seen organizations like Higher Heights and others say, look, we need a return from you, Democratic Party. We need more seats at the table. And this is an important seat. And so while it is true that Kamala Harris cannot represent all Black women or all South Asian women, it is notable that part of this is also a response to that. And the fact that it will be both symbolic and, to Danielle's point, substantive, that she will bring this perspective, the perspective of her lived experiences to the table, will certainly matter, and I think is an important point of reference. And also I'm curious to see how much her role will also bring other Black women, South Asian women, folks who have worked for her and with her into the administration. So that's another piece of representation. And then I would just say, there's also the symbolic piece is also just disruptive of the dominance of white men at the presidential level. And so not only do we see a different image of what is presidential, but I think it starts to challenge our individual expectations of who can and should be in these roles. And I hope that it has an effect so that in 4 or 8 years, when we are choosing the next set of candidates, that we don't say things like, well, I like her, but I don't think she's electable. Because she will be serving in the number 2 role, and I think under Joe Biden, a role that will be substantive. In other words, not a vice president that doesn't have an agenda or who isn't given serious responsibility. My sense from what he's talked about and from him being a vice president himself is that he will give her the space to really develop those credentials and develop those achievements that will make it hard for folks to discount her qualifications going forward.
Thank you. Those were excellent points. And I think all of us feel very similarly about her candidacy, of course, but also then her position as the first female vice president. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about the US Congress. Obviously, this is an expertise of all 3 of you. But for the second consecutive election cycle, we've seen this increase in not only the number of women running for office, but the number of women winning elective office. What do you think really explains this increase? Do you think it's something specific about 2020, or do you think this is sort of the progression of female office holders? And do you think there's a lot of questions, I apologize. Do you think there's an upper limit, or do you think that there is just going to continue to be this increase in the number of women? And so I'll start with Professor Kudrowski with this question.
Thank you. That's a great question. And yeah, we are seeing now a record number of women who will be serving in the United States Congress. I think we finally, as a country, cracked the 25% threshold. So is there, an upper limit? I certainly hope not. But I also don't think that there's going to be a huge sea change. I think that at best we are going to continue to see incremental increases. Now, having said that, I'm really glad that there is an increasing number of Republican women who are going to be serving in Congress, that the gap between, the proportion of Democratic women to Republican women will be somewhat smaller. I'm also gratified to see that there are more women of color, a record number of women of color who have been elected to this Congress. That diversifies the Congress, and it diversifies the women's voices. And I think too often there's sort of a conflation of Democratic perspectives with, women's voices are Democratic voices. And of course, there are a lot of Republican women. They bring a certain values and experiences to the table that were really underrepresented. And I think it's a good thing for the country that we are seeing such an increasing diversity of women who are going to be in Congress.
Dr. Dittmer, do you agree with the assessment that this is sort of more incremental, or do you see this sort of more as an explosion?
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of averse to the language of waves and surges, even though I know it makes sense. But I do think, we have certainly seen in 2018, the increase the proportional increase was greater. So yes, we are seeing a record number this year. It will not be as large of a jump, although I will say we are getting there and we still have races to be called. But so the increases we've seen, and especially the increases in candidacies we saw, were especially large in 2018. So getting at why women ran in 2018 and what was spurring them, this was a challenge, I think, for all of us doing this work, because every reporter and everybody observer wanted one reason. What was it? Women woke up after the 2016 election, they were pissed off and they decided to run for office. And that was the narrative that really got out there. And it was a bit frustrating for many reasons. One is it was hard to combat because for some women that was true. But for a lot of women, they had already been in politics. If you look at the women who won in Congress in congressional seats in 2018, a lot of them were in state legislatures or other levels of office. And so they were already on this path, but there was a window. There was a window of opportunity in which they could leverage not only their gender, right? Because we were talking about gender equity, it's highly salient in the election, but also their positioning worked out well in that year that ended up being better for Democrats to make the decision to run. An important reason why that story in 2018 was so frustrating is because, especially for women of color, the idea that they woke up after the 2016 election and saw that there was inequity and they felt threatened was not at all new. And so while there was certainly still that sense of urgency, and that increased across Democratic and progressive women of all racial and ethnic groups, there was different stories about why and how. And I think one thing we saw particularly for Black women, for Native American women who won for the first time in 2018, was a sense that we can't only be leading the activism from the outside, we need to claim our seats within these institutions. And so translating that activism into candidacy, that was a really positive thing we did see in 2018 among candidates, and actually continued on to 2020. So somebody like Cori Bush, who was leading Black Lives Matter movements and then ran in 2018 and then said, and Danielle can speak to this, then said, I'm not gonna just not run again, right? I'm gonna continue to run. The last thing I'd say about 2020 is the story is really different. So the story about why women ran in 2018 is pretty different than what we're talking about in 2020, because in 2020, we're talking largely about the increase in Republican women's candidacies, not progressive Democratic women who are running against Donald Trump and his politics. Here, you're talking about women who largely are supportive of the president. In fact, some are motivated, when you look at their public discussion about why they ran, motivated to go into Congress to back Donald Trump. And very much seem to be mobilized within that MAGA sort of movement. And then also noting that there is a certain level of the Republican women saying, you all said that we did so poorly and our party's so bad for women, we're gonna sort of prove to you that that's not the case. And lastly, there's been some organizations to credit and individuals on the Republican side, like Elise Stefanik, Winning for Women, ViewPAC, who've really problematized the underrepresentation of women in their party and made a public call for more women to run and win.
Go ahead, Danielle.
I'll
You
just
don't have to wait for me. Go ahead.
I'll just add a few points on the ceiling as well as the successes in 2018 and 2020. So I don't think that there is a ceiling necessarily, but like Kelly said, the last two elections have really been historically unprecedented in terms of the rate of growth. And I think it's especially difficult to increase the number of women by large margins as the number of women in office increases even higher. And in terms of 2020 in particular, before the polls and before the expectations that were developing in October, even September, I think most people who follow women in politics would have looked at the congresswomen who were up for re-election in 2020 and expected some of them to have a tough year. So many of them were coming from more marginal districts, which is different from other years. So Barbara Palmer and Dennis Simon had a really good quote to describe Democratic men being perceived as the first to go, usually because of the kinds of districts that they were coming from. But that wasn't the case in 2020. At least a lot of the more women who were up in 2020 were coming from some tougher districts. I think some of us also would have expected that these losses would have been offset by gains that other women were expected to make in safer districts. And that's actually kind of what we saw happen in 2020. I think in October, we were expecting the gains on the Democratic side to be a little bit larger because some of these competitive races were expected to go towards the Democrats, which it didn't happen. But in terms of like which party is able to contribute to growth more, I think this is the potential is more on the Republican side just because they have much lower numbers to begin with. The other thing I'll say about what happened in the increase in 2018 and 2020, so a lot of people talk about women's candidacies, and this is incredibly important. And of course, the number of women in office can't increase if the number of candidates doesn't increase. But one thing that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should is how voters can actually contribute to these years where more women were elected. So in these more wave years where larger numbers of women were elected, in 1992, Democratic women were more likely to win the general election than Democratic men. Since the 2000s, Democratic women have been faring far better than Democratic men in the primary. One thing that's notable about 2020 is this was the first year that Republican women actually fared better than Republican men in the primary election. And usually the narrative is when women run, women win, that women aren't biased at the polls. But there is evidence that women are favored at the polls, especially in the years where more women are elected. So I think we should maybe give a little credit to the role of voters in their role in spurring these larger numbers of women in these years. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, all of you.
Jump in again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Danielle raises some really wonderful points, and you might say, well, if women are actually favored at the polls, how come, you know, they're only at 25%? And I think one of the things to remember is that as we see turnover in state legislatures and in Congress, the seats that women held they're not necessarily replaced by other women. Right. So very often as women retire or they're term limited or, you know, move on to higher office, the people who fill those seats are not necessarily women. So I think one of the things for us to really watch is as President-elect Biden fills the administration with senators, and we know he has a very, you know, clear commitment to diversity, what is going to happen to the seats that are currently held by women in the Senate and the House? And who is going to replace them? So that's, I think, one of the reasons why we see that there's just been slow incremental change rather than anything particularly dramatic.
That's a really great point, especially about the idea that we could actually have less representation for women and people of color if Biden appoints all of those folks to the Senate or to the cabinet. That's a really fascinating point because you can't guarantee that their replacement will be identical in terms of those characteristics.
And we will also have that loss already. So while we celebrate Kamala Harris being obviously the first woman vice president, this also means that at least until we know who Governor Newsom appoints, we will have no Black women in the next Senate. And the number of women in the Senate will assuredly go down from where it is today. So this is certainly the issue that Karen's pointing to, which is what we, you know, call planning ahead, right? And trying to make sure that we can fill in the losses that women have. I did just want to say real quick, because I think Danielle raised this really important point about what are flip seats or particularly difficult seats to win. So in 2018, Democratic women were really responsible, you could argue, for flipping the House, right? The House of Representatives from Republican to Democrat. They won the majority of those flipped seats. That is why going into this, we knew that they were in the most vulnerable seats. The 9 Republican women this time around, of the 17, so more than half of the Republican women who are newcomers who won, also flipped seats from Democrat to Republican. Of those, 4 of them flipped seats from other women. And so the dynamics that are at play are certainly that these women will continue, both on the Democratic and Republican side, to be in these most vulnerable seats, at least as the current makeup now. And the fact that we had a record number of women versus women races this year is both something to celebrate, but also a note about, that means that sometimes it doesn't advance that final number as much as you might expect.
Excellent points. Go ahead.
One related point to some of the previous comments that were raised. So one other reason for why this matters for the future is when we think about, I know it's too early to say like 2022 and stuff, but of the 28 Republican women who are going to be in the 117th Congress, half of them are coming from safe districts and half of them are coming from a pretty broad measure of competitive districts. And on the Democratic side, they're more than twice as likely to come from safe districts. And so what this matters in a lot of ways, both for how the number of women in the next subsequent Congress is likely to probably go down from the current number, and also their ability to advance within the chamber. And this gets back to one thing that Karen raised too. So one of the I think very interesting facts is of the Republican women in Congress right now, only one of them has been in office since before 2000. So this has really hindered their ability to rise up the ranks in a way that Democratic women have been able to do and advance to chair positions and gain leadership positions within the party. So all of these factors, like where they're coming from and how vulnerable the caucus, or how precarious the caucus is, I would say, has really important implications for future numbers as well as leadership.
Let's dig into Republican women then, since this has been raised multiple times, and 2 questions. So we've talked about the fact that there's, Republican women will have at least 28 seats. So 2 questions. Why did Republican women do so much better this year than in the past? And why has it been difficult for Republican women to keep pace with their Democratic counterparts in terms of the numbers? Is it something about Republican voters? Is it something about sort of state legislatures? What's part of the story here? And it can be many. I won't restrict you, Kelly, to one explanation. You can have 10 if you want. So let's start with you, Kelly.
Don't give me that opportunity. You'll be here all night. So no, I think that I don't think, and obviously everybody else in this panel is expert on this too. I don't think there is one clear explanation anyway, but one that I point to in terms of, so I'll start with the last question. Why has it been an issue for women in the Republican Party? Certainly, first of all, there's been change over years, right? So that partisan gap has actually grown, and now we're going to see some closing of it, but still the majority of women in Congress will be Democrats. Democrats will make up a much larger Democratic women will make up a much larger proportion of their caucus than will Republican women. So these party issues don't end simply because this year was a record-breaking year in which Republican women will still be 28 of 435 members. So, and I should say the previous record was 25. So part of what we're seeing in the jump is that they lost 10 seats in 2018. So it seems so much more significant, and it is in some ways, but we also have to put it in that context. So why have we been here? I'm going to leave it to Danielle to talk specifically about the data, because she knows this stuff in terms of Republican women and primaries and challenges that we've seen over time. But I would say party-wise, to think about the culture and philosophy of the party. One thing that we've struggled with at the Center for American Women in Politics is getting buy-in from party leaders, particularly Republican Party leaders, that gender disparities are in and of themselves a problem. And it's not because Republicans are saying we don't want women in office, but their philosophy is anti-identity politics, right? We don't play identity politics. We choose the best candidates Should they be men more often? Should they be white men more often? That's just how it is. So women, we want you to run, we want you to be successful, but we're not going to do targeted recruitment, targeted fundraising, the work that has been done on the Democratic side, not always by the party, but outside groups and others who've created a support infrastructure that is more robust for Democratic women. And related to that, a specific example that I always, I think most folks probably on this call know, is to look at the work of Emily's List and really changing the playing field, because they come in and they say, sure, Democratic Party, we're going to support these women, we're going to support candidates financially, but if you choose a guy, that money goes away. So now we're talking about millions of dollars that Emily's List has been able to raise and really change the course of particular elections. That goes away if the party doesn't support women candidates in those seats. And so they become influential, and they've incentivized the party to more specifically, I would argue, prioritize women's representation. And then briefly on why Republicans did so much better, Republican women did so much better this year. I think I would just caution that they did do better, but they're still, so, win rate wise, sure. But they went into this election in very difficult races that were certainly never certain. So one of the reasons why they did better on election day was because Republicans did better than expected, and they were in the toughest races. So we could have easily been having a conversation today about how Republican women did worse than the men because these races broke Democrats. So it's just a little bit of context for us to be careful about when we characterize, if it's this shattering year in which we're going to see this trend continue for Republican women.
Danielle, do you want to pick up on on the data?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I would even add to what Kelly is saying and say, I think it's kind of a fluke. Like, I think this huge election of Republican women, I mean, if you look at these the 27 cook toss-up seats, right, that are, as of now, not one of them has gone to the Democrats, I don't think, as of the last time, like yesterday. This is super unexpected and enormously lucky for Republican women. And I definitely think that we should be cautious about general elections in particular, and even primary elections, like as a proportion of candidates, they're still really underrepresented. But they are doing better than ever before, and compared to Republican men in the primary. And it is sort of important for who is then able to compete, who is able to be a fluke, right? Who is able to be a fluke in November depends on who wins. And as the number of safe seats increases, and as the primary becomes even more important for choosing who the party's nominee will be, I'd say like women as a fluke is better than men as a fluke, But one other thing I would add that I wouldn't say there's any one sort of factor either, but I think that that the emphasis on the pipeline needs to get some renewed attention. And it gets a lot of attention in public treatment. Like, the media talks about the bench all the time, but I don't think in scholarship we do as much. I've looked at a lot of different pipelines to office, and so state legislative pipelines. I recently looked at lawyer donors, so lawyers who contribute to political candidates, and how and which ones run for office, with a data set of like 400,000 lawyer donors that Adam Bonica and Maya Sen collected. And the gender disparities and the partisan disparities are enormous. So we know that the number of women in law school has increased, and it's, at parity with men, but that doesn't mean that the pool of lawyers and active politically active lawyers is, these pools are still heavily skewed in favor of men. State legislatures are heavily skewed in favor of men. And I think we need to look at just the gender makeup of these common typical pathways to higher office and sort of change the narrative there and say what Kelly raised before too about parties investing in the recruitment of a single candidate. So I think we need to start thinking about women being more likely to run than men, women being more likely to be recruited than men, because if we wait for I just don't think equal rates of running are going to translate into the outcomes that like anything close to gender parity, precisely because the pipelines, I mean, anything about any pipeline, business, men, military, men, law, men, like any of these typical path state legislatures to Congress, they're just overwhelmingly male dominated. And I think this has, people said this a long time ago. I mean, this is what the 90s really emphasized, but those explanations have kind of fallen out of favor. And I think we should revisit them.
Wow, it's really hard to follow these two. But I just want to, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about what I saw here in Iowa, which I think kind of illustrates some of the things that we saw happening nationally, but it kind of puts a face to it. So I'm sitting here in the middle of the country, right? And Iowa, I have learned, is actually more like the rest of the country than what its reputation for corn and hogs might actually imply. So on that end, it's a small state and there are 4 members of the House and 1 member of the Senate. So we had 10 candidates or nominees, major party nominees for these 5 federal offices. Out of those 10 candidates, 7 of them were women. And there were 3 female versus female races. So Joni Ernst and Teresa Greenfield, and then the 1st district and the 2nd district. And, sitting here in the greater Des Moines metropolitan area, which is not an oxymoron, is that, we were able to, it's really a statewide media market. So we were able to see ads from all of these candidates, which is really a fascinating way to then be able to be a social scientist. And what I found is that it's not that gender went away in the female versus female races, but it played a different role. So both candidates were much more likely to be talking about motherhood and families and the traditionally female issues. And I think all of that, just that there was such a sheer number of them, is that it normalized women running for office. And the transformation in Senator Joni Ernst was really fascinating. 6 years ago, she was the first woman elected to federal office ever in Iowa, right? And she ran a very masculine campaign. She talked about castrating hogs. I'm not kidding. She talked about castrating hogs. She talked about her military service. She talked about taking aim at special interests, where she pointed a gun at the camera in one of her ads, highly masculine. This time, she talked about her military experience in terms of what she was doing for sexual assault survivors who were in the military. She talked about her own experience in domestic violence. She talked about her failed marriage. She talked about her daughter. It was a completely different kind of race. And I think the fact that she was running against a woman allowed her to reflect and talk about how her own experiences as a woman she could bring to the Senate and how she had already done that. It was an absolutely fascinating set of case studies. And so while women to women races don't necessarily lead to increased numbers of women in Congress, it does, in fact, I think, normalize women as candidates and gives all women the legitimacy in terms of running for office.
That raises a really good question with regard to candidates running female candidates running against other female candidates. Are the strategies different for running against, if you're a female candidate running against a female candidate versus a female candidate running against a male candidate? do you think that that's what's driving Joni Ernst's change, or do you think it was just sort of seeing 2020 as a different kind of year, that different topics had to be addressed, or do you think what do you think drives that?
I think it really freed her up that she didn't have to embrace this sort of hypermasculinity because she was not facing a male competitor. And at the same time, she was being really attacked by her counterpart as being sort of a Trump twin. That was actually the term that Teresa Greenfield was using to criticize Ernst, and she actually didn't respond to that at all. She didn't try and say, oh, I'm my own person or anything like that. She just let it sit there, and she won handily. But it was really fascinating, and it was echoed somewhat in the other races where there were female to female. Abby Finkenauer was tarred as being close to Nancy Pelosi, and they made a big deal that her first vote was for Pelosi as speaker, and then her Ashley Hinson, one of the women who defeated her, actually, talked about her loyalty to the GOP. And the other race remains absolutely undecided. It was a 47 vote margin in the 2nd district, and they're going through a recount. So we don't know who's going to win that district.
Could I speak to that for a second, Beth?
Absolutely, please.
So I think that is a possibility, right? That yes, a woman races could free up. I think that's a good way Karen put it, right? Like gender, I always out there saying gender doesn't neutralize in a race. In fact, gender has been important in all races, all male races for so long. But this piece about masculinity and the demand on women to prove their masculine credentials, it really also varies by race. And no matter if it's a woman race or a male-female race, in terms of, so you've seen women in all-female contests still trying to prove their masculine credentials. A really good case of this is Martha McSally in her Senate race against Kirsten Sinema, where the opposite happens. She doubles down on this highly masculinized argument and actually uses it to try to attack Kirsten Sinema as being too soft, too feminine. There's literally an ad called Pink Tutu, in which she takes a photo of Kirsten Sinema, obviously at a Code Pink rally, right? But to say she's not serious enough to be in the US Senate. So, and we saw more of that this year, and there were more Republican women. At one point, we went through all of the House candidates' websites and ads, and there were, the Republican women, for the large part, ran in ways much more aligned with the idea that masculine credentials are important. So pro-gun, pro-life, anti-socialist. Not to say that there weren't these cases as well as using motherhood and things like that, but there are partisan differences that we see in terms of the way they navigate gender, and that's in part due to what the voters demand. So similarly, you can look at a Public Religion Research Institute polls that have said consistently that Republican voters, particularly those who support Trump, are more likely to argue that society is becoming too soft and feminine. And so if that is the case, men and women candidates face an environment in which they are expected to demonstrate that they are going to push back against that, right? In whatever way that means in terms of their exercise and leadership. So I think it's a mix too. And I think thinking about the geographic space, the competitiveness of the race, so the Ernst race versus a race somewhere else where it might be differently competitive and what types of voters they're trying to get to, demonstrates again that women aren't running in any singular way, but there is variance based on all these other factors and how they navigate gender.
So Kelly's the real expert in this area, so I don't have much to add, other than there's a new paper I think is interesting by Rachel Porter and Sarah Truell that showed that looked at men and women candidates in 2018, and they showed that the men who run against women start talking about gender issues more than the men who don't run against women. So I think that kind of suggests that candidates are strategizing in a way that Kelly's research shows that we would expect, that the kinds of issues that they're emphasizing are related to the attributes of their competitors. And then the other sort of little tidbit I'll add is I heard a really good quote like yesterday from a news article or something, that the Republican women of the Chamber of Commerce, so it used to be that Republican women were associated with like the Chamber of Commerce kind of Republicans, but now they're Second Amendment Republicans. And it's just, I mean, you look around and that's exactly what we're seeing. The kinds of Republican women are sort of intertwined more in this masculinity than I think the Republican women of yesteryear were. And so it's kind of hard to separate these things out just because of the policy issues that they're embracing now versus, 2 decades ago.
We also have, I meant to say, in terms of the contrast, not in the same race, so not an all-female race, but we had a group of Republican women early on in the cycle come out to say that they are the conservative squad, and so really position themselves as a counter to the women, particularly women of color in the squad in Congress. And I think that gets us into also sort of dangerous territory about like they very much, the language they're using is about being the right kind of woman and not the dangerous socialist kinds, which obviously has racial undertones as well. And so recently, Nicole Malliotakis, who identifies as both Latina and white, she's been talking about, she was tweeting about the fact that, again, they're gonna create, she has a name for it, it's not the conservative squad, but some version of that as well. They're gonna create their own caucus sort of women who are anti these other women. And again, we want more diversity of women in office, but when it is leveraging gender in that way, we do have to just interrogate that. Like, what does that mean for women's advancement?
So one of our audience members has a question related to this discussion we're having. And Annie asks whether Republican women's views differ in a notable way from their male Republican counterparts. Are they just as likely to toe the standard party line? And it sounds like what's being suggested perhaps is that they're more likely today perhaps to toe that line than in the past. But can you guys speak to that notion of issue positions sort of rather than strategy in particular? Let's go with Kelly.
Yeah, I think one of the hard things here is there's a distinction between Republican women in the electorate, so sort of public opinion, and the Republican women who are being elected, which I think is sort of what Danielle was speaking to on this notion of Second Amendment Republicans, right? So the Republican women who we were seeing running and especially make it through the primaries, ultimately who will serve in office, I don't think there's a huge variance. We will see once they get in office in terms of their voting records, but certainly what they were saying on the campaign trail, I had quite a few people be like, well, there's some moderate Republican women, right? And I was like, I don't think that they are among this group. Young Kim might be the closest. And yeah, Danielle, you're gonna know better than me, but somebody who at least has been vocal against the president, but there's not a lot. So I do think we'll see even a greater closeness of Republican men and women among elected going into this next Congress. But among voters, just to note that there are places, we try to keep track of just gender gap along different issue areas, and this is not my full area of expertise, so I don't want to overspeak, but certainly there are some areas in which you actually have seen those gender differences persist on things like LGBT rights, environmental issues. But in recent years, that has also led some women to just leave the Republican Party. So now it's harder to tell if you've just lost women completely from the party or if they've stuck around and they'll push the party on some of these issues.
I think one of the important things to remember is that the best predictor of vote choice amongst members of Congress is party. And of course, if these women want to move up in the party ranks and take on positions of leadership should the Republicans ever gain control, they're going to need to toe the line so that they can, move into subcommittee chairships and otherwise, gain the accoutrements of office or even see their legislation passed. So, in both parties, party loyalty is prized and rewarded, and we can't forget that.
Yeah, I'll also add that I think it's harder today in Congress to go against the grain than it was before. That members used to get a pass maybe on certain issues, or leadership just expected them to be, a hard get in a way that now I think is just kind of expected. So, in some ways, people do say these things like, are Republican women more moderate? And it really is so temporal that it's like, well, which Republican women are you talking about? If you're talking about Republican women of yesterday, that's most certainly true. But I mean, even Susan Collins looks different than the Susan Collins of before, of a decade ago. And I think that is illustrative of the challenges that probably men and women face in going against the party caucus today. And that's part of the reason why we see this growing similarity. And that's been happening for a while. So we've seen similarity between Republican men and women in Congress for a while now. But I have no reason to expect that would change in the next several Congresses.
Danielle, I just wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, do you think that's partly why, this is how I've been interpreting it, that's also why you're seeing Republican women do better in primaries. So in other words, if you run more conservatively, that increases your chances of getting through this partisan primary. So instead of always thinking like it's the reverse, they're just, they're doing better, the same women are doing better, you're actually talking about a different class of or different type of Republican women candidate.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely true. I did a couple of surveys of primary voters to ask them how liberal and conservative they think Republican women and Democratic women are. And a lot of research says that Republican women are viewed as more moderate. I didn't find any evidence of that, but some of this other research was done at a time when Republican women were more moderate. And so a lot of these, we would expect this to reflect the reality of the Republican women who are running. Democratic women are viewed as more liberal, but again, they are more liberal. So, and they have been since the 90s. So, but today, the Republican women who are running are as conservative as the men. Primary voters see this, they think this, and I think 2020 was also different in the bump that they got in the primary. I don't think that will last just because of the party identity stuff that Kelly was talking about before. But it was notable, this year. I would also say one more thing. I've seen a couple well, maybe I'll just wait until we're probably going to get to the comments. So, yeah.
Great. So I do have one more question I want to ask from the audience, and then we're going to pivot to voters, talking a little bit more about female voters. But a number of folks, Kayla, Annie, are asking about this election of Kamala Harris and to the vice presidency. Does this get us one step closer to electing our first female president? Do you think perhaps 2024, or when do you see this becoming a reality? And let's start with Karen this time around.
Thanks. And where's my crystal ball, right? Whether or not 2024 is the year that we would nominate and elect the first woman president, I think remains to be seen as to what Joe Biden is going to do. And if he chooses to run for another term, then it's less likely, because I think that, given everything that we've been saying about the two major parties, it's going to be far more likely that the first woman that we elect as president of the United States will be a Democratic nominee. Now, having said that, here in Iowa, we did get to enjoy the company of 6 women who were running for president during the caucuses. And while none of the women actually survived through the primary process very long. It was very interesting to see them campaigning and learning how to do the kind of long-term campaign that's required in order to go through and be successful at the presidential level. So again, that I think works towards normalizing that women are presidential candidates, and I think certainly Harris will have a leg up whenever an opportunity opens for her to run for president again. And as as a former vice president or the incumbent vice president, she will be in a very strong position to get the Democratic nomination and perhaps to secure the White House.
Kelly, do you want to pick up next?
Yeah, I think, one thing I have a bit of a broken record, but hopefully this is a new audience. The one thing I've been saying throughout the cycle is I was really lucky to speak to a woman who worked on, she was communications director for Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial campaign in 2018. And she said this thing to me and I was like, can I use that? Can I cite you and use this? Because this is the clearest explanation for a particular hurdle that women face at this top executive level. And in this case, in Georgia, it was certainly true more specifically to a Black woman seeking to become the first Black woman governor of the state. So her name is Priyanka Mantha, and she said, we had to run 2 campaigns. We had to run our normal campaign, and then we had to run a concurrent campaign of belief. We had to not only prove that Stacey Abrams was the best candidate for Georgia, she had the best policies, all the things the dudes have to do as well, but we then had to say, don't worry, she can also win. And so all of the time and opportunity costs of time, labor, emotional labor, resources that women candidates, especially at these high levels, have to spend in order to demonstrate to others that they can just win, speaks to the electability issue, the electability myth that certainly plagues the women who ran in the presidential nomination for the Democratic presidential nomination. You saw Elizabeth Warren have to talk about it on a campaign debate stage. She actually ran an ad in which she had an old white man talk about how electable she was. You had Kamala Harris at nearly every campaign stop using this line that she's now using. I like her, it's great to hear it now, but this idea that we won't be burdened by what has been, that she has faith in the American people to be unburdened by that, when in fact she was probably a little premature in the faith in American people to not be burdened by what has been. So I just think to get to a woman president, it is combating that electability myth among voters so that their concern is not, well, I like her agenda, I just don't think she can win. Because I do think that was happening. I don't think it was all pure sexism. I mean, obviously that's gender bias baked in, but there were voters who I think are very feminist, and very, really wanted to see a woman, but also feared that if they chose a woman nominee, she couldn't win against Donald Trump. And so if we can start to combat that and really push back against the electability myth, we reduce this need for these women to have to run more difficult and dual campaigns. I think that's going to be important to get to woman president, but I'm certainly not making a prediction on what year.
I've also avoided making predictions mostly now. One thing I will say that's hard with presidential elections is it seemed like they always seem like the candidate selection could turn on a dime. And like with I study congressional elections, and there's so much data and there's so many years, and there's just, I just feel more certain of things that I can say and claim from the data. And with presidential elections, I can easily imagine a scenario where we would have already had our first woman. I mean, I think many of us imagined that scenario where we had already had our first woman president. And so obviously this didn't happen, but I don't think it's too far off. And I also don't know if it has to do with Kamala Harris taking the vice presidency. I mean, yes, in the sense that this is a pathway for being a president in the past. So yes, in that way. But I would say that coupled with the increasing number of women in presidential, in the nomination process is suggestive that at some point in hopefully not too long, this will happen.
Okay, I wasn't going to hold you to those predictions if you said it was 2024 or 2028, but okay, fine. I'm going to say it's 2024. You guys don't want to go out on a limb, but I will. We'll say 2024. Nobody's going to hold it against me in 4 years, so that's fine. All right, so let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk about female voters, because I think this is also a really important issue, and there's a number of questions that I think have come up over the last year, especially with regard to female voters. So one of the things that this is a very personal question to me, which is, COVID has hit caretakers particularly hard, and women are disproportionately responsible for their caretaking duties within the home. So what are the unique challenges, do you think, facing women in 2020, and did those challenges spill over both in terms of vote choice and voter turnout during this particular election? And let's go Danielle first.
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head with the caretaking aspect. So the main consequence for women that is both being burdened from the extra like childcare responsibilities at home, as well as caretaking responsibilities for their parents. And so I think that this is clearly something that's had a disproportionate effect on women. I don't know whether this manifested in different ways for voting behavior of men and women. And the reason that I say that is because I was on an election panel with my colleague, Michael Tesler, who is an expert on race, politics, political behavior. And he showed these really interesting graphs about how presidential approval dipped in the summertime. So not this more recent wave of COVID cases and COVID deaths, but rather much earlier in the summertime. And importantly, showed that presidential approval in the summertime, in like June, July, is really highly correlated with election outcomes and presidential vote share. So I think that this certainly mattered for Trump's reelection, or lack of, for Biden's election. But I just don't know if that worked in different ways for men and women. Not to say that the pandemic has not had serious gendered consequences and has disproportionately affected women and women of color, but I just don't know if it mattered for voting behavior in a different way.
Karen, do you have any further insights for us?
I think Danielle is spot on. And of course, one of the surprises that we had with this election was that the gender gap was smaller than what some of the polls had predicted. There were, in previous audiences, I was talking about a gender canyon instead of a gender gap. And it turned out that it was big, it was 12 points or so, but not nearly the 22 that were mentioned. And that's because more men voted for Biden than what was initially predicted. And so again, like Danielle said, we don't know why, but we do know that COVID was, people's concern about COVID was a major predictor for a vote for Biden. So that could be very well true of men and women, even though women had obviously borne a very disproportionate impact. They were more likely to be unemployed. They don't have two shifts, they have two simultaneous shifts with working and caregiving responsibilities. And then you add to that the larger just uncertainty about caring for a family, and that has definitely fallen disproportionately on women.
Yeah, and I would say, I think that's right. A lot of this is a bit of hypotheses before we have better data. The exit polls, so we have two versions of an exit poll. We have the Edison exit poll this year. We have a VoteCast election survey that has been used by other media outlets to make our lives particularly difficult. There's pretty decent differences among them and how important a lot of things are. So a little bit of a plug here. We finally put out our release this afternoon. It should be out now, from the Center for American Women in Politics about gender differences in voting. And what we did is we took 4 polls. We used those two, as well as the CES, the Cooperative Elections Study, as well as Latino Decisions, who did specific oversamples of the Latino, African American, and Asian American community. They also have some additional Native Americans samples, so that we could look across the board to try to get some overall themes and gender differences within groups. This does not directly answer your question about COVID effects, but I think these are other sources to look at and try to get a sense. Most of them, if not all of them, ask some questions about COVID. And I think that's the data we'll all have to sort of dig into to see, are there gender differences in terms of those predictors that are coming out in these election polls? And the one piece I will say, and this is more a hypothesis than anything, because again, I can't prove this to be true, but one thing I've been thinking a lot about the cycle, and it seemed to be anecdotally true in like reporter interviews with voters, for whatever that is worth. And I think it is worth some things, but we just have to be careful. But is to think about, Donald Trump was very reliant on a sort of law and order protection, right? That hyper masculine model of like, I will protect you women. I think that there were at least some women for whom security was not so tied to security, both national or my suburbs, you know, and then the sort of very blatant message that he was giving there about, you know, security against communities and individuals of color, but that their security that they were looking for was, can you secure my health? Can you secure my family's economic well-being? Can you get my kids back to school? And that was probably not true of the strongest, you know, Trump supporters, but certainly of women who we were thinking about in that college-educated white women group that did see a continued shift to Democratic support in this election.
All right, so that raises, so we've touched on the gender gap, and so let's just tackle it head on here. So obviously women have been moving away from the Republican Party since the 1980s. Do you think though that this gap is really just, again, is this an accelerating gap? Are we past the real acceleration? Has the big move happened and now we're just going to see sort of incremental change? Or what do you anticipate for the increase in this gender gap between men and women in terms of voting for the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party? And we can start with Kelly on this one.
I don't think we've really seen an acceleration. In other words, we've seen a gap that varies over time. If you're looking at presidential vote choice, and certainly to Karen's point, if you use the Edison poll this year, it's 1 point higher than the last time. And last time was a record, but it was tied in the 1990s. So it's just not a very, and also I think it's a moment for us to sort of question whether or not a 1 point difference. It's very funny because those of us, you know, who do methodology are like, 1 point is nothing. But if it's the gender gap, it's a record. And we at the center, by the way, we are at fault for a lot of this. So part of how we reported it this year was to say like, well, let's be a little bit careful. So I think what you're pointing to, Beth, though, is important to know among what groups are we seeing shifts. And certainly if you look at white women overall, 2016, the shock of individuals at white women voting Republican was not a shock for those of us who study this, right? We knew that white women had been reliably Republican for a long time. The extent to which you are seeing some pull away, the majority of white women still voted for Donald Trump this year. That number is either higher or the same based on the exit poll you look at as 2016. But this distinction between non-college educated white women really actually, to the extent of increasing their loyalty to the Republican Party, and college educated white women moving further to support Democrats both in 2018 and 2020. To me, that's where you see the difference. And I think a question is, do we see that group or women within that group come back to the Republican Party if it's not Donald Trump's Republican Party. And because a lot of folks are wondering, I think, if it's a Trump effect. I'm not really convinced it is, because if you look over time, this shift was happening before Donald Trump. But I think it's a worthy, it's a question for us to consider. And then just obviously to be very clear that the gender gap, if we look at an overall difference, is rooted in Black women, and more specifically women of color, pushing the overall number and average, if you will, of women's alignment with the Democratic Party to the left. And so we have to just, again, recognize and appreciate the nuance there.
Yeah, I'll just add to a couple of those points. So I think also, like, social scientists, change is so gradual and it's so slow, and I just think you might see changes over like a 3-decade period. Like, then we could start seeing something that's fundamentally different than what we have now. But I mean, even within decades, there's just not so much change among these like larger groups. Jane John and Natalie Masuoka have a really interesting article called "The Gender Gap is a Race Gap," and it's exactly what Kelly is talking about. One of the interesting things that they show in their article is that differences in education are far more influential for or predictive of white women than women of color. And so one of the reasons I think this matters for the gender gap is not really even white women, but rather whether women of color could, like Latinx women or Black women, we would see more variance within this group in the next couple of decades. And if they sort of start to break along educational lines in a way that's similar to white women. Now, for that to happen, I think the Republican Party would have to change enormously on a policy front and be a totally different party than they are today. And so that's why I say, like, over a 3-decade period, you could maybe see a little like evolution, but those are all very big ifs. But I think those kinds of things would be a force for larger change in the gender gap than a point or two.
I will say, when I was reviewing the data in preparation of this session, that when I was looking at the gender gap numbers, I was really surprised by really how consistent they were and how little variation there was from year to year. But to bounce off of Danielle's point and Kelly's point, this is really a story about intersectionality. Because the stories are very different depending on the intersection of education and race and gender altogether. But I would also add increasingly age, right? So the 2013 Republican Party that did the postmortem after Romney's defeat was really spot on in terms of the Republican Party needing to expand its appeal to a broader coalition of voters if it's to have any sort of long-term success. And Trump's success in getting elected president does not change that, right? So for all of the noise that's been made about Trump pulling away some Latino voters in Texas or Florida, or a few more points of African Americans, that really just negates the point that still Democrats overwhelmingly won those demographic groups. But I would add another one: young voters. Young voters who are more highly educated than their grandparents' generation also broke heavily towards the Democratic Party. So I think what we would see is that unless there are some changes to the Republican Party, the advantage that the Democratic Party enjoys is going to remain. The demographics are just there in favor of the Democratic Party.
So all of you have raised the intersectionality question, and that leads to a question about some racial differences, racial and ethnic differences among voters. In particular, one of the things that all of you have pointed out is that white women are voting very similarly to white men, but we don't necessarily, we see a larger gap in this particular election between non-white women and non-white men. So you have this, whichever exit poll you rely on, 91% of Black women are voting for Joe Biden, but only anyone should be so lucky to get only 80% of an electorate, but 80% of Black men, 70% of Latinx women, and 61% of Latinx men are going for Biden. Do you think that gap between even, under 10 points or so between non-white women and non-white men is something particular, as perhaps Karen pointed out, with regard to Donald Trump, or is that something that we might see going forward with either presidential elections or maybe even congressional elections? And yeah, Kelly.
I want to be careful because I think this is the problem of the exit poll, which is that the exit poll is notoriously terrible at racial subgroups.
Right.
And so if you look at Latino decisions or even vote cast, you don't see a difference that is that stark. In other words, you see a similar gender gap among white voters, Black voters, Latino voters, and you see a higher level of support for Joe Biden among Latinx and Black voters. So this is not to say that there might not be that there, but my take on this is that there is a gender gap that is persistent among racial and ethnic groups, except, at least with the data we have right now, except among, it is smaller and it has gone back and forth if you look at historic data, but again, there's not great data among Asian American or AAPI voters at this point. And I think, to me, that's the piece that's most interesting. What is consistent in those gender differences across racial groups, even though the overall story is quite different. But I think it is to be careful about, and smarter folks than myself. I know I was listening to Cheryl Laird this morning on the NPR Code Switch podcast, like talking about the issues around some of these data points saying like, oh, it's Black men and Latino men who are really pushing this move away from Democrats. I think part of it might be also bad data.
Yeah, so it may not be the question. Maybe let me frame the question a little differently in that, is it the case maybe then that we're going to see differences, however slight, again, whether it's 10 points or 6 points or potentially what Kelly's talking about, which is, if we can't actually survey that population, we're relying on really small samples, then we're going to get really interesting and skewed results with regard to these populations. Do you think that Donald Trump did anything then to appeal in a way to non-white men that perhaps he didn't do for non-white women? That's a better question.
I'll do my quick follow-up to say,
yes.
He certainly tried. What I think we don't know is if it worked or not. That's my own bias of like, I think there was no doubt. I mean, you could see his direct appeals, particularly to Black men, and you could see in advertisements. I mean, go onto his YouTube page if they didn't air in your area, but of Black men speaking and saying how terrible Biden was on criminal justice issues. So it was certainly an attempt. I think it's hard as of yet to determine whether or not and how effective that was at shifting ultimately outcomes.
Danielle, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'll also add just one quick thing. So there's one thing that strikes me as kind of interesting when people talk about 2020 and like any election is change from the previous election. So we could see changes from the previous election, but also a very stable foundation of support. And I think that's kind of, so we focus on these maybe few point changes from the previous election, but still, like you said, 80% is a really sizable base of support. And the other thing that I would add that I think is really unique about 2020, and Biden himself has acknowledged it in his victory speech, but it's quite rare where you would attribute a candidate's victory to one group of people. And Biden's victory is really rooted in Black voters in South Carolina. And I think that like presents a totally different rise to power that what Kelly was talking about too at the beginning with respect to Kamala Harris presents like new opportunities for him to acknowledge where his support came from, and the fact that, you know, as like presidential elections can kind of shift course in this way. And his definitely did in South Carolina. And so a lot of the, you know, the change about, or the, you know, I don't know what the end results will say, just like Kelly is saying, but I do think stepping back, it is clear that Black women and Black men played a really large role in his ascendance.
I think one thing that we're all getting to here is that in any election, what we see is that the outcome is a product of both idiosyncratic factors as well as long-term trends. And certainly the Clyburn endorsement was one of those sort of idiosyncratic things that really solidified the African-American support behind Biden. And I was talking to somebody who was working on the Biden campaign, and they were aware of the slippage that they were that they ended up experiencing in Southern Florida. They knew that was happening, and that the message about socialism was gaining some traction there. And part of their concern was that there was no Latino Clyburn. There was no single leader who was respected across that, you know, those demographic groups, because of course, Spanish-speaking Americans, Latinos are very, very diverse, is that there was nobody who could play that role within those communities, and that was their concern.
That's a great point. We now have time for some audience questions. So I think Jennifer is going to join us and ask a couple questions that I haven't gotten to from the audience.
Yes, I am. So the audience has been busily asking questions in the Q&A, and you all you've been really fabulous panelists. Thanks so much. You've addressed a number of their questions, either directly or indirectly. So, but we've been going through and looking, and we have a question about the potential impact, or what do you think about the impact that a Biden administration could have on the level of female representation in Congress, if he does kind of, or even in the state level, right, in the state houses or the governorships, if he does what President Obama did and nominates a lot of people, you know, what's the pro and con of that? What's the long-term impact, if any? So anybody who wants to.
I mean, I'm happy to take a first step, because we're watching this every day at the center to try to figure out how difficult this is going to be to put out our numbers for the new Congress. Because presumably what's going to happen is we're going to have an entering number, and then within a couple of weeks, we're going to have a difference in terms of women's representation. I would say it actually goes, there are two things to watch. So on the one hand, yes, he might tap women who are currently in Congress, and therefore we lose some of that representation. But then it will be up to governors, and I think the Biden campaign or Biden transition team is quite thoughtful about what this will mean. And I don't doubt at any level that there aren't conversations being had about, if I choose this woman governor, who might you appoint, or depending on the state's rules and everything, you know, who's sort of tapped next for these positions. So, or at least I shouldn't say I don't doubt, I'm hopeful, and I think that they're having these conversations so that you could see also filling in some of these positions if they are lost to women, replaced by women. Again, this is a conversation in the Senate. I've heard mixed things about what Governor Newsom will do, but I do think there's increasing public pressure for him to be seriously considering either specifically a Black woman like Barbara Lee, who is obviously very well qualified and positioned to be a senator from California, Karen Bass as well, or to be even more broadly thinking about perhaps a Latino woman that, again, underrepresented in the US Senate. So I think that there will be an effect, but I'm hopeful that it might not have the negative effect, if you will. And then I think we have to think about the overall positive effect of having women leading some of these agencies. A real example that you've seen probably talked about a lot in the news is if Deb Haaland was nominated and appointed to be Secretary of the Interior, to be the first Native person, Indigenous person to hold that position. Not only is she a great legislator, but I think she would be great in that position. Would I like to see the number of Native American women in Congress go down from such a small number? No, but I think that her ability to have an impact, especially if it's honestly a split Congress, she probably will have even greater impact as Secretary of the Interior. So all those calculations, I think, are important to make when we think about women's empowerment, political empowerment across these agencies and institutions.
Any other comments, Karen or Danielle?
Yeah, so I'd also say I think what's going to amplify the impact of this administration is its real stark contrast to the current administration. So it's pretty hard to get more white or more male than the current administration. I mean, it's just overwhelming. But one other positive effect that this could have, which relates to the state legislative point that you're talking about, or that was raised and mentioned, is that there's other research showing that women in very high, very visible positions spurs women's candidacies at lower levels of office. So that is one way in which more women Congress is a really high office in a lot of ways, but members aren't as visible as cabinet positions. Most of them on average. And so it could increase the visibility of women in a way that would increase the number of women at lower levels of office. But again, a lot of these things are so slow and they take so long and it's really hard to it's really hard to measure, it's really hard to attribute to the appointment of any single woman. But there is research suggesting that there is a relationship between these things.
I would also just remember that for decades, women who were in administrative support roles were told that they couldn't be moved into managerial positions because they were too valuable in their lower level roles, right? And so we wouldn't want that to be a reason not to promote women from a governorship or from Congress into a cabinet level position. And certainly there are ample women who are currently serving who would bring talents and knowledge to these roles, as well as being just absolutely historic breakthroughs to see their appointments. And one thing that we know is that as there's a greater expectation of diversity, I think there will be more pressure on Democratic governors to make appointments of, to have women succeed women who might be appointed. Congressional races, of course, will be special elections, and there we would have to see that women are actually running.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for those great insights. There's another sort of theme from the Q&A from audience members, and that's a pop culture theme. And they asked two different questions. One sort of about the impact of pop cultural media presentations of women in television. And then the other was a little bit more specific about Harry Styles appearing on the cover of Vogue in a dress and Candace Owens attacking him for it. And I think that the audience is sort of interested in what's the impact of pop culture and these kinds of things on people's attitudes about women in executive leadership. Does the pop culture help or hinder women when something like the Harry Styles thing comes up. Anybody want to take that one?
Somebody else start before me. I feel like I'm talking too much.
I'll add a couple of things. So I know nothing about pop culture, so I will be the worst respondent, and then it can only go up from here. But I will say that in some ways, so like Kamala Harris cooking with Mindy Kaling, I think I would put that in the pop culture bucket. So in a lot of ways, I think any influence of pop culture has been to make politics more fun, like not this particular example, but I think some social media sort of treatment of it has been to humanize politicians or to make fun of politicians or to, in a way that I don't think we had as much before around politics. And maybe that's this moment and this like hyper activism and interest and turnout, but a handful of politicians did an interesting job of making them more accessible and more familiar to voters, which I think is interesting. But again, that's from a non-pop culture expert.
First, I want to say that this question will be a great dissertation for somebody. So if there are any graduate students out there who are looking for a topic, there you go. You know, and I was just thinking in my head about House of Cards, Veep, and Secretary. And I'll leave Harry Styles to the side, you know, for the moment. But in terms of those, I think what it does is that it shows the diversity of women in political roles, right? So, you know, one is high-minded and authoritative and highly effectual in her role. One is a comic and one is devious and demented, right? So in that way, we see that these women politicos are being, you know, shown in a whole variety of ways. And in the fullness of humanity. And I think that instead of having just a single stereotype, or as we know from so much media coverage of women candidates, is that it's about their clothes and their hair, and then fourth or fifth on the list is actually what they stand for, that what we're seeing here is a more nuanced and complex picture of women as humans. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I would say too, I think we always have to credit not only just pop culture, but art, you know, theater and television and writing to push us to think differently about, again, this idea of what can be. And so there have been instances where these shows, as Karen's pointing out, can demonstrate and make us think differently about what is possible. I mean, you're talking about in some cases, really, in all of the cases in which you have a woman president in these shows, it being something that we don't have a real life comparison to. So there's also some shows I always show in class, like clips from Parks and Rec and Scandal, where the women candidates directly call out biases and stereotypes that we would love to see women who are candidates for real do on the campaign trail, but they all are like, I'm not gonna maybe call out that reporter in that moment. But the fact that they do that raises to your average viewer who might not necessarily see campaigns through that lens, a different way to think about the questions we ask of women candidates or the way that we treat them that might be different. So I think there's a real tool. I don't know that our pop culture and has leveraged that tool to the extent that I think we could in having better representations of these issues. But there's certainly some progress. And then I would just say on the Harry Styles piece, because nobody wanted to take it, I think that I've written about this a lot because of really starting with Donald Trump in 2016. And I mentioned before this piece about these findings on society becoming too soft and feminine. And I think this is what you see. So what the Harry Styles instance, I think it's the opposite. It reveals where voters are at, not voters, but citizens broadly speaking, and this division over how we understand and think about gender that often does in fact align with party and along ideological lines. And there's a psychological theory about precarious manhood, right? This idea that femininity is something innate that we have, but masculinity is something that you have to win and prove, right? Continually prove, and you can lose it. Donald Trump has played into that more overtly than others in recent history in trying to emasculate all of his opponents, whether they be male or female, so that there is this sense of threat. So then you have a man, in the case of Harry Styles, presenting in a feminine way, and therefore raising these additional critiques of, you are not man enough, you are threatening manhood. And I think that's something for us that's a real issue and a cleavage in society that affects politics, but it is well beyond politics in terms of what it means about our acceptance of full gender diversity, not a binary acceptance of women and men, but an acceptance of the full spectrum of gender expression and identity.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Jump into this is an idea that I've been turning over in my head for quite some time. The literature on media coverage of women candidates and women office holders really does focus on how often women are trivialized, and what's used as evidence of that are the conversations about their clothing and their hair and things other than the issues that they present. Yet what we have seen, especially in the last 4 to 6 years, is that a lot of women office holders and candidates are actually using their clothing to send a message. So it's like they're adopting what is often seen as something that trivializes women and turning it into power, right? And so the most extraordinary and clear evidence of this are the Democratic women who all showed up in white at the State of the Union. And they have done that now for 2 or 3 years. But, Hillary Clinton wore purple when she gave her concession speech, and she was going to wear that same purple suit for an acceptance speech rather than a concession speech, because purple is the combination of blue and red together, right? So it was a symbol of unity. And so using that color, and of course, even on the campaign trail, she would talk about the sisterhood of the traveling pantsuit and why she was known for wearing pantsuits and things. So I think, again, in terms of dissertations, I think other people ought to write. There is a really interesting set of questions here about how the symbols that were used to denigrate women are now being adopted by some women as a symbol of strength and to send a political message. And if somebody doesn't write that dissertation, I'll have to make it a book. Just saying.
We have a couple other questions about electing women and about campaign funding. So I'm going to ask the campaign funding sets of questions first. We have an audience member who was wondering how presidential campaign funding was affected for both the Republicans and the Democrats when Biden selected Harris, and whether or not there were any down ballot impacts of having a woman on the presidential, vice presidential slot. And then what the audience member wanted to know was there a connection back to public support, i.e., if the fundraising, I assume, went up, what does that say about voters?
So I can say a couple things on this. So in some ways, the number of women donors was more equitable to the number of male donors in 2020. So I think it was like 45% of donors were women, 55% were men, something like this. But I think that this is too celebratory. So Open Secrets has done a lot of really great work on gender and campaign finance. And one thing that they've done that's really great is to not only show the numbers of donors, but the amount that they're donating. And we still saw in 2020 that men gave almost 2/3 of the money, whereas women gave about 1/3. So there's a lot of different reasons for why this might be the case. So we might think that women are more likely to support Democratic candidates, and Democratic candidates are more likely to raise money from small donors, or something of this sort. but I still think it's too early, given that the amount of money that women are giving is proportionally very similar to what we saw in 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. To say that women are to expect then like a different kind of influence as a result. I do think it's encouraging that women are politically active in this way, because I think donating, I mean, I have no evidence of this, but my sense is that donating is an habitual activity. So if you donate once, you're probably more likely to be asked. You're on these email lists, you're probably more likely to be asked again. So it might hold these implications in future elections, but I still would exercise caution before saying that women are exerting an influence in the donor pool that is like reflective of their numerical numbers.
And very briefly, because I think that's right, we don't really know, and folks can do some smarter analyses of these. One, also, we don't have all of the data in from those last couple of months, which are most key if you're trying to look at the effect of a Kamala Harris nomination. I do think as well, one thing to be cautious about is the research that we know to date about how influential it is to have a woman candidate or a woman on the ticket. You know, it is still limited by parties. So I know along the way, folks are like, well, you know, does it increase Biden's vote share? Maybe not. Does it increase turnout and enthusiasm? Maybe more likely. And I think there is where you would wonder if that enthusiasm would translate into some of those donations. But it's very hard to isolate that factor, as Danielle's made a good point of, like, how much of it is gender? How much of it is the intersection of race and gender? How much of it is that she's more progressive than Joe Biden? So there's a lot of pieces that would be, without direct questions to voters about what, or donors, what motivated their donations, it might be hard for us to ever know.
I agree with both Kelly and Danielle.
Okay, well, I have one last question. Oh, no.
One follow-up on that that I was thinking about. I do think, however, that perceived ability to fundraise and to attract money was not unrelated to, I mean, that was a lot of the conversation right after the selection of Kamala Harris. So I thought that people, and I think perceived ability to raise money really matters in terms of how much of a coalition of support that you can build.
Which, by the way, is why Kamala Harris dropped out of the presidential. When asked what was the reason, well, I wasn't able to raise the same amount as everybody else. So that's a great point.
Okay, so this is our last audience question that we'll ask you all. And this comes from Blaze Cohen, who wants to know if there are any factors that indicate that women are or may become less involved in politics than they are right now.
I don't think there's anything, and I wonder too if that question also is asking, are there indicators of different women that are more or less involved in other ways?
Or different types of involvement, I think.
Yeah, because there, I think one thing to just think about, a couple of things from the research perspective. One is, what do we deem participation? So this is something in the literature that's debated, right? So what do you count? And so the very white male dominated participation literature would have certain measures of what it means to be a participant in politics that probably excludes some of the outside influence that women, and particularly communities of color, have, how they have played a role in politics when excluded from those formal routes of participation. So if we think more broadly, I do think we tend to measure then fewer gender disadvantages. In other words, women participating at equal rates, if you consider different definitions of what is political activity and action. And one other piece I'll just say, which is not a direct answer to the question, but a reference to other smart folks. I always go back to, I really appreciate Wendy Smooth's discussion when she talks about Black women's participation. And she really paints the picture of, if you looked at every demographic indicator you would think that Black women would be less likely to participate, right? There is formal exclusion, there are class and network differences, there are access to money, all of these things that would make it seem that they would be less likely to be participants, when in fact, they participate at higher rates, particularly when she's looking at candidacy and success in state legislatures over the last 2 decades, that nearly all of the gains for Black state legislators was among Black women. And she talks about this as the paradox of participation. So I think hopefully a little bit to this question, perhaps saying the indicators, some of the traditional or conceived indicators of like, well, if you are more marginalized, therefore you don't participate, is not a direct comparison, at least when it comes to, in this case, running for office and being successful.
Yeah, and I'll also just add, particularly with respect to donating. So I don't think that there have been any decreases over time in participation. I think what we don't know is the degree to which there's been an increase or staying the same. One really good analysis of gender, race, and campaign finance shows that women of color are underrepresented in the donor pool. But I'm not able to answer. That's not an overtime analysis, so I don't know whether whether it's more underrepresented than before. But there are certainly disparities in participation. We might not see them in voting. We might not see them but to Kelly's point about it really matters the kind of participation that we're talking about. And among donating, we do see these gender race disparities that are really important.
I agree that I don't anticipate seeing a decline in women's participation. I actually anticipate that what we will see are probably gradual increases, right? And it will be gradual. But I think one of the things that I have heard from some people who are active in the Black Lives Movement is, which has really done a lot to involve young people, not just young people of color, but young people more broadly, is that they think, well, we had a protest, so now the policy will change. And that the next step in that political education is to get them involved in policy making, so that they understand how the process works, and then, that they might run for office, or they might do some lobbying or testify or do those more conventional insider strategies to augment the outsider strategies.
This is a point that I should have just included, that when we talk about participation, particularly voting participation, obviously to be cognizant of attempts to disenfranchise. So we are in the midst of a political, what I would call political spectacle, but it is very serious that there are actual real efforts to disenfranchise groups of voters, particularly communities of color. And so that is men and women. That is not a particularly gendered effect. But when we think about participation, also thinking about formal structural ways in which you discourage or marginalize participation of groups, obviously is important for us to highlight.
Thanks, Jennifer, for those audience questions, and thank you, audience members, for offering us quite a few questions. I did incorporate some of the questions into my questions so that we could get to more of them. And so now we'd just like to thank our panelists for coming and for providing such great insight. It may have surprised you, but almost 2 hours has flown by. Maybe it doesn't feel like flown by to you guys, but it's flown by for us. And we really, really appreciate all your insight and your hard work on this topic generally. And so a little shout out for the 2 institutes represented, the Catt Center at Iowa State and the Center for American Women in Politics out of Rutgers. So please take a look at both of those institutes. They're really producing good work with lots of great data. So I encourage you to go find the experts at those 2 institutes. There we go, Kelly. Yay, plugs. Plugs are good.
And if I can speak, I think both the Center for American Women in Politics and the Catt Center are now in the business of giving away money. So our deadline is the 22nd, this coming Sunday. So please send us your applications, and Kelly, jump in and talk about what COP is.
Yeah, we have a granting opportunity for scholars, advanced graduate students or PhD faculty and that is due on Monday. So that is all on our website.
Well, you've got the weekend. Everyone's got the weekend to get it done. There you go. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we appreciate all your insight. And a little plug for the Southwestern, we're going to be having some sort of conference in the spring. It's still up in the air whether we will be virtual in this format or live in New Orleans, but stay tuned. We'll let you know. We also have our third speaker series, the third installment of our speaker series will be in February. And I think that's the COVID one. We're going to be focusing on the government response to COVID, both nationally and both at the state level, nationally in the US, and then in sort of international comparison. So please come to that as well. And you'll see that on our Facebook and Twitter feeds when that's ready to go. And so with that, I will end the meeting. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.